In the cold winter of 1776, a different kind of army was at work. It was not made of soldiers in red coats. It was not made of soldiers in blue coats. It did not carry muskets or cannons. It was invisible. It was silent. It was far more deadly than any human force. It moved through cities. It moved through camps from person to person, leaving a trail of devastation. This secret army was smallpox, a disease that haunted the 18th century like a recurring nightmare. While the American colonies fought for their independence from Great Britain, they were also fighting a desperate battle against an ancient plague. This plague respected no flag. It showed no mercy, striking down soldiers, striking down civilians. The story of the American Revolution is often told through its famous battles and heroic leaders. Lexington conquered, the crossing of the Delaware. We remember names like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. But behind these familiar tales lies another, darker story. It is the story of a virus that threatened to destroy the Continental Army from within. It shaped military strategies. It influenced political decisions. It determined the fate of thousands. It was a constant presence, a hidden enemy that could turn the tide of war more decisively than any single battle. The fight for liberty was also a fight for survival against a microscopic foe. To understand the American Revolution, we must understand the terror of smallpox. Imagine a disease so contagious that it could spread with a single breath. Imagine a sickness that caused raging fevers, agonizing pain, hideous pustules that covered the entire body. For those who survived, it often left deep, permanent scars or blindness. In the 1800s, in the 18th century, smallpox was a fact of life, but it was also a profound force of death. It killed nearly 1 in 3 people it infected. For colonial Americans, who had less exposure to the disease than Europeans, the death rate was even higher. This fear was a weapon in itself, one that both sides of the conflict would have to confront. This essay will explore how this one disease shaped the course of American history. We will look at how smallpox influenced George Washington's most critical decisions as commander-in-chief. We will examine the timeline of the war, tracing how major outbreaks coincided with pivotal military campaigns. The central puzzle we will try to solve is this: how did a virus help decide the outcome of a revolution? By looking at leaders, the suffering of ordinary soldiers, the medical knowledge of the time. We can uncover the secret history of America's first and perhaps most dangerous war. It was a war fought not just for independence, but against a plague. The American Revolution was fought on 2 fronts. The first was the visible conflict against the British Empire, a struggle for political freedom and self-governance. The second was a hidden biological war against the smallpox virus. This internal war was just as important to the final outcome. The British Army had a significant advantage. Most of its soldiers came from European cities where smallpox was common. Many had been exposed in childhood and were immune. They carried a silent immunity that made them formidable, not just on the battlefield, but in the disease-ridden camps and hospitals of 18th century warfare. In contrast, the Continental Army was dangerously vulnerable. Its soldiers were mostly young men from rural farms and small towns. They'd lived in relative isolation, far from crowded cities where smallpox thrived. No prior exposure meant no natural protection. Crowded military camps became perfect breeding grounds for the virus. An outbreak could sweep through a regiment with terrifying speed, incapacitating hundreds. For George Washington, smallpox was a constant strategic nightmare, a weakness that could cripple his army before it faced the enemy. This essay follows a timeline from 1760 to 1783, showing how smallpox outbreaks shaped key moments. We'll begin before the war, exploring early attitudes toward inoculation. Inoculation, risky, but sometimes effective. Then the Siege of Boston in 1775, where fear of smallpox shaped Washington's first major decisions. Next, the disastrous Quebec Campaign, where epidemic disease destroyed American forces more than British arms. The disease was a constant factor in planning campaigns. recruiting troops, maintaining morale. Finally, we'll address myths and controversies. Did the British use smallpox as a biological weapon? Was inoculation a miracle cure, or more complicated? We'll look at primary sources, letters from Washington, diaries from soldiers, separate fact from fiction, correct common misunderstandings, and show what was actually known. This journey shows the birth of the United States was not only a triumph of ideals, but also a story of medical struggle and survival against a powerful, unseen enemy. Smallpox was one of the most feared diseases of the 18th century. It was known by many names, including the speckled monster. The disease was caused by the variola virus, a microscopic organism, invisible and unknown to the science of the time. It spread easily from person to person. An infected individual could pass the virus through the air by coughing, sneezing, even just talking. It could also be transmitted through direct contact with the fluid from the sores that covered a patient's body. The virus could even survive for a time on contaminated objects, bedding, clothing, making it incredibly difficult to contain once an outbreak began. The symptoms of smallpox were terrifying and progressed in distinct stages. After being exposed, a person would feel perfectly healthy for about 12 days. This was the incubation period, when the virus was multiplying silently inside their body. Then, suddenly, the illness would strike with high fevers, chills, severe headaches, intense back pain. This initial phase would last for a few days, often leaving the person weak and delirious. Just as the fever began to subside, a rash would appear, starting on the face, hands, and then spreading rapidly to cover the entire body. This was the moment everyone dreaded, as it confirmed the diagnosis of smallpox. The rash soon developed into raised bumps that filled with a thick, cloudy fluid. These were the characteristic pustules of smallpox. They were incredibly painful and itchy. In severe cases, they would merge together, forming large, continuous sores that covered the skin. This was the most dangerous stage of the illness. The patient was in agony, often unable to see or swallow. Death, if it came, was usually the result of overwhelming infection, internal bleeding, or other complications. For those who contracted the most virulent form, the mortality rate was alarmingly high, approaching 30% or more. If a person survived the ordeal, the pustules would slowly dry up, form scabs, and eventually fall off after about 3 or 4 weeks. This process left behind deep, pitted scars, known as pockmarks. Blindness was also a common outcome. While survivors gained lifelong immunity, the physical and psychological toll was immense. In the 18th century, with no cure and no real understanding of viruses, an outbreak of smallpox was like a death sentence hanging over a community. It was a disease that left its mark on everyone it touched, one way or another. In the 1700s, medical knowledge was extremely limited compared to today. Doctors did not understand what caused diseases like smallpox. The concept of germs, bacteria, viruses was still more than a century away. The most common belief was the theory of humoralism. Health was believed to be the result of these 4 humors being in perfect balance. Illness, therefore, was caused by an imbalance. To do this, physicians used a range of therapies. One of the most common treatments was bloodletting. Other methods included purging the digestive system with powerful laxatives or emetics to induce vomiting. These treatments did little to help the patient and often made things much worse. Draining blood could easily lead to shock or death. Given the lack of effective treatments, the main strategy for dealing with smallpox was prevention. When an outbreak occurred, officials would try to enforce quarantines. These measures could help slow the spread, but they were often difficult to enforce and could not stop the virus once it had taken hold in a community. Long before the invention of vaccination, there was another method for trying to control smallpox: inoculation, also known as variolation. This practice involved deliberately infecting a healthy person with matter from a smallpox pustule. The idea was to induce a mild case of the disease in a controlled setting so the person would develop immunity without having to endure a full-blown, life-threatening infection. The procedure was not a European invention, introduced to the Western world in the early 18th century, partly through Lady Mary Wortley Montagu in England, and an enslaved African man named Onesimus in Boston. If the inoculation was successful, the person would develop a fever and a small number of pustules, a genuine case of smallpox, but it was typically much milder. The mortality rate from inoculation was significantly lower. While about 1 in 3 people died from a natural infection, only about 1 in 50 died from inoculation. However, inoculation was not without its serious drawbacks. The person who was inoculated became contagious. For this reason, inoculations had to be carried out under strict quarantine. It was a difficult choice, to risk a dangerous but potentially life-saving procedure, or to live in constant fear of the natural disease. In the decades leading up to the American Revolution, public opinion on inoculation was deeply divided on both sides of the Atlantic. Religious leaders often argued that it was against God's will. They preached that diseases like smallpox were a punishment for sin. Others raised practical objections, pointing to the very real danger that inoculation could start a new epidemic instead of stopping one. In Boston, Cotton Mather and Zabdiel Boylston championed the procedure, but they faced violent opposition. An explosive device was thrown into Mather's home. Benjamin Franklin was initially hesitant, but after his 4-year-old son, Francis, died of natural smallpox, Franklin later wrote he bitterly regretted not inoculating him. George Washington had first-hand experience with smallpox, contracting it in Barbados in 1751. He survived with mild scarring and lifelong immunity. By the 1760s, inoculation was more accepted in larger cities. In rural areas, suspicion remained high. This created a dangerous patchwork of immunity. The vast majority of the countryside was a vulnerable landscape. This unequal distribution of immunity would have profound consequences when war broke out. When the American Revolution erupted in April 1775, Boston became the first major battleground. After Lexington and Concord, thousands of colonial militiamen surrounded the city, trapping the British Army inside. This began the Long Siege of Boston. The city was under siege from 2 enemies. One was the newly formed Continental Army. The other was smallpox smoldering within Boston's crowded confines. General George Washington arrived in July 1775 to take command, and he was immediately confronted with this dual threat. His army was mostly non-immune farm boys, and an outbreak in camp could be worse than a British assault. Washington wrote constantly about its ravages. His first orders were strict: any soldier showing signs of smallpox to be removed to a special hospital far from camp. Rumors and deep suspicion followed. Some Americans, including John Adams, feared the British might use the disease as a weapon. Washington, receiving them, was deeply suspicious. He wrote to John Hancock about Howe's diabolical scheme. No definitive proof of official policy, but the act had a powerful psychological effect. Washington placed the refugees under strict quarantine. The siege became a nerve-wracking waiting game. Washington fought the British and an invisible internal threat. While Washington managed the delicate situation in Boston, another American military operation was unfolding. The Continental Congress authorized a bold, 2-pronged invasion of Canada. One force captured Montreal. The other, led by Colonel Benedict Arnold, undertook a grueling march through the Maine wilderness to attack Quebec City directly. The plan was ambitious, but it failed to account for a crucial enemy that would march alongside the American soldiers: smallpox. It was in these dire conditions that smallpox began to circulate. The crowded, unsanitary conditions were a tinderbox, and smallpox was the spark. They chose to attack. On the last day of 1775, the Americans launched their assault on Quebec City. The attack was a catastrophic failure. General Montgomery was killed. Colonel Arnold was severely wounded. Hundreds of American soldiers were killed or captured. But as they waded through the brutal Canadian winter, their real enemy, smallpox, tightened its grip. The disease spread like wildfire. John Adams stated that the primary cause was smallpox. The smallpox is 10 times more terrible than Britons, Canadians, and Indians together. When British reinforcements arrived, they found an American force that was already defeated. The Quebec campaign was a complete disaster, ending any hope of Canada joining the revolution. The disastrous outcome of the Quebec campaign served as a harsh lesson for George Washington. He had witnessed firsthand how smallpox could destroy an army. After the difficult winter, at his winter headquarters in Morristown, New Jersey, he knew he could not afford to take any more chances. So, in February 1777, Washington made one of the most important and riskiest decisions of his military career. He ordered the mandatory inoculation of all new recruits to the Continental Army. This was a massive undertaking. Each inoculated soldier would be sick and contagious for several weeks. To carry out this plan without alerting the British required extreme secrecy and careful organization. Washington's orders were clear and firm. He wrote to his commanders that they must go on with the inoculation as fast as they can. He instructed that new recruits should be inoculated in their home states. For soldiers already in service, special hospitals were set up. It was the first large-scale, state-sponsored mass inoculation program in American history. The program was a remarkable success. The vast majority survived and gained the lifelong immunity Washington sought. By the summer of 1777, a significant portion of the Continental Army was protected from smallpox. This strategic decision fundamentally changed the biological balance of power. He had effectively removed one of the British Army's greatest invisible advantages. This bold public health initiative ensured that the Continental Army could stay in the field and continue the fight for independence. After years of stalemate, the British shifted their military strategy. They turned their attention to the south. The southern campaigns were brutal and marked by a different kind of warfare. This new environment also brought with it a different landscape of disease. While smallpox remained a constant threat, it was now joined by other deadly illnesses like malaria and yellow fever. Smallpox once again played a crucial role, particularly among the enslaved population. British General Henry Clinton issued the Philipsburg Proclamation, which promised freedom to any enslaved person who escaped. However, they brought with them a vulnerability to smallpox. The crowded and unsanitary conditions became deadly breeding grounds for the virus, and a devastating epidemic erupted. Eyewitness accounts describe horrific scenes of sick and dying people being abandoned by the British forces, who were unable or unwilling to care for them. Lord Cornwallis lost thousands of potential laborers to the disease. This loss of manpower severely hampered his army's mobility and logistical capabilities. For the American forces under General Nathaniel Greene, thanks to Washington's inoculation program, the core of the Continental Army was largely protected. However, the local militias that joined them were not. The smallpox epidemic was a humanitarian catastrophe that weakened both sides, but it particularly undermined the British strategy of leveraging local support and manpower. The climax of the war came in the fall of 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia. A combined force of American and French troops marched south to trap him. During the siege, smallpox was present within the British lines. In a desperate and cruel move, Cornwallis expelled many of the sick African Americans from his lines. He hoped to, perhaps, spread the disease to the American forces. However, Washington's army was now prepared. The mass inoculation of 1777 had paid off. Hemmed in by land and by sea, Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender on October 19, 1781. The victory at Yorktown effectively ended major combat operations. Even after the fighting stopped, smallpox continued to cast a long shadow. The widespread epidemics had left tens of thousands dead and scarred the social landscape, but they had also forced a revolution in public health policy. Washington's inoculation program demonstrated the power of decisive, large-scale medical intervention. One of the most persistent questions is whether the British intentionally used the disease as a weapon of war. The fear was certainly real for the colonists. Despite the fears, there is no definitive smoking gun document, no official order from London, that directs systematic use of smallpox. The most famous story involves the use of infected blankets. Its historical roots are actually from an earlier conflict, Pontiac's War in 1763. During that uprising, British officers at Fort Pitt did carry out a plan to do exactly this. This documented event from 1763 has often been mistakenly transposed onto the Revolutionary War. There is no concrete evidence that a similar blanket strategy was used against the Continental Army. The true story of smallpox in the Revolution is less about a single dramatic evil act, like giving infected blankets, and more about a persistent, grinding war of attrition. It is a myth to think of it as a perfect or complete shield. The inoculation program was a massive, ongoing logistical challenge that was never fully completed. Record-keeping was patchy. We will never know the exact figures. Estimates suggest that the death toll from smallpox may have been over 130,000 people, many times greater than the number of American soldiers killed in combat. The smallpox epidemics of the Revolutionary era constituted a continental crisis. It spread west to the Mississippi, north into Canada, and south to Mexico City. The epidemics hit Native American tribes with particular ferocity. Similarly, the thousands of enslaved African Americans who fled to the British lines found themselves in disease-ridden camps. In the final accounting of the American Revolution, the ledger of victory and defeat cannot be balanced with battles alone. The story of independence was written also by the relentless march of a virus. Smallpox was more than just a tragic backdrop. It was an active participant, creating a second silent front in the war for America's soul. George Washington's great gamble, the mass inoculation of his forces, stands as one of the most critical strategic decisions of the war. It leveled the biological playing field. In the end, the revolution was won as much in the quarantine hospitals as it was on the battlefield. The virus left a trail of death that far surpassed the casualties of combat. Smallpox was the unseen victor in countless unrecorded skirmishes, a secret army whose influence was decisive in the birth of a nation. The conflict left behind a legacy of scars, both literal and figurative. A demographic catastrophe that reshaped communities and left a deep imprint on the American psyche. The war had demonstrated the power of state-sponsored public health intervention, fostering a climate of innovation that would soon embrace an even greater breakthrough. The English physician Edward Jenner would develop the process of vaccination. The United States, with its recent memory of the horrors of smallpox, was uniquely prepared to adopt this new science. The momentum created by Washington's wartime measures carried forward. The struggle against a terrifying disease forced a young nation to innovate, to organize, and to embrace science in the name of survival. In this way, the secret army of smallpox did not just decide the outcome of the war, it helped to shape the very character of the nation that emerged from it.